The appointment was made for 10 o'clock. That was the first unusual thing. Rodrigo Velez Mora did not typically receive visitors at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday without knowing their names in advance. His secretary, a woman named Carmen, who had managed his calendar for 11 years, had informed him the previous Thursday that a man had called and requested a meeting, brief she was told, 30 minutes at most, and had given only a first name and the name of a textile supplier in Itagi that Velez Mora had done business with twice in the previous year. Carmen had confirmed the appointment because the supplier's name was legitimate, and the caller's voice, she told Velez Mora afterward, had been entirely ordinary. Polite, unhurried. The voice of a man scheduling a routine meeting. Rodrigo Velez Mora was 54 years old in the spring of 1989. He had built his textile operation from a single workshop in the eastern part of the city over 30 years, expanding methodically, reinvesting carefully, developing relationships with buyers in Bogota and later in São Paulo and Miami that had turned a family enterprise into the largest private employer in Antioquia outside the agricultural sector. He had done this without political connections, without inheritance, and he was proud of this and said so when asked, without arrangements of the kind that had become increasingly common in Medellín's business community during the previous decade. He was not a naive man about what was happening to his city. He read the newspapers. He had colleagues who had made accommodations and colleagues who had refused them, and he had watched over the years what happened in each case. He had formed his position on this question early and had not revised it, that the moment a legitimate business accepted money or protection or arrangements from the other economy, it ceased in some essential way to be a legitimate business. The line once crossed did not uncross. He had communicated this position when it had come up, clearly and without drama. It had come up 3 times in 30 years. Each time the conversation had ended and nothing further had happened. He had concluded from this that the position was respected, or at least understood, and that the clarity of it provided a kind of insulation. He was still holding this conclusion when Carmen showed the visitor into his office at 10 past 10 on that Tuesday morning. The man who walked in was not what Velez Mora had expected. He had constructed, without fully acknowledging that he was doing it, a mental image of the visitor based on the supplier's name and the ordinary voice. Middle management. Someone looking for a contract extension, perhaps, or an introduction to a buyer. A man with a briefcase and a rehearsed opening. The man who walked in carried nothing. He was heavy-set, wearing dark trousers and a plain white shirt, the collar open. His hair was dark and slightly disheveled, as though he had not paid close attention to it that morning. He was perhaps 40 years old. He moved through the office the way men move through spaces they are assessing rather than spaces they are entering as guests. A slight pause at the threshold, a brief reading of the room before committing to it fully. He sat down across from Velez Mora without being invited to sit. "I appreciate you seeing me," he said. Velez Mora said something about the supplier connection, asked how he could help. The man across the desk listened to this with the patient attention of someone who has already moved past the preliminary part of a conversation and is waiting without impatience for the other person to arrive at the part that matters. When Velez Mora finished, the visitor was quiet for a moment. Then he explained briefly and without ornamentation who he was. The office was very still after that. Velez Mora did not move. He was a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where things were being decided, and he had learned early that the quality of stillness you brought to those rooms was itself a form of communication. He looked at the man across the desk and kept his expression where it was, composed, attentive, and said nothing immediately. He was buying himself the seconds he needed to locate the version of himself that knew how to respond to this particular situation. He had thought about the situation in the abstract many times. He had not thought carefully enough about the specific texture of it, about how ordinary the man would look, how quiet the room would be, how much the moment would resemble every other business meeting he had ever sat through. "I know who you are," Velez Mora said. The visitor nodded slightly. "Then I'll explain what I'm proposing," he said. And he did, clearly, briefly, in the language of business rather than threat. An investment arrangement. A percentage of the operation's import capacity used for the movement of certain goods. Compensation that Velez Mora understood, as it was described would represent more than his company's annual profit. A relationship that would, the visitor said, be invisible from the outside. A matter between two people in a room. Velez Mora listened to all of it. When the visitor finished, there was a silence. "No," Velez Mora said. The visitor looked at him. His expression did not change. He did not lean forward, did not adjust his posture, did not show anything that could be read as reaction. He simply continued looking at Velez Mora with the same measured attention he had brought into the room. "I want to be clear," Velez Mora said, because he felt the clarity was important, and because silence in a moment like this could be misread in either direction. "This is not a negotiation. I'm not asking for different terms or a different arrangement. The answer is no." The visitor nodded once, slowly. Then he stood up. "I understand," he said. His voice carried nothing. No anger, no disappointment, no particular weight. The voice of a man receiving information and filing it. He crossed the room. At the door he paused and turned back. And for a moment Velez Mora thought he was going to add something, to qualify the departure in some way. But the visitor only looked at him for a moment. The same flat, cataloging attention he had brought to the initial reading of the room. And then he was gone. Carmen appeared in the doorway seconds later, her expression somewhere between curious and alarmed. Velez Mora told her to hold his calls. He sat in his office for a long time after the footsteps had receded down the corridor and the sound of the elevator doors had opened and closed and the building had returned to its ordinary sounds. He sat with his hands flat on his desk and looked at the chair across from him, which was pushed back slightly at an angle from where the visitor had stood, and he tried to take the full measure of what had just happened. He had said no. The visitor had left. Nothing had occurred. He understood, with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms, that the absence of an immediate response was not the same as the absence of a response. In the months that followed, Velez Mora noticed things. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to directly, taken to a lawyer, reported to authorities. That was the specific quality of what happened. It existed just below the threshold of the actionable, in the register of the observable, but unprovable. A buyer in Bogota who had placed orders reliably for 6 years began requesting extended payment terms, then became difficult to reach, then missed a delivery window without explanation. A shipping arrangement through Barranquilla that had functioned without incident for 4 years encountered what the carrier described as regulatory complications. A key factory supervisor, a man who had been with the operation for 11 years, gave notice without explanation and left the city within the week. Each event individually was explicable. Buyers changed. Logistics encountered complications. People left jobs. The world moved in ways that did not always require interpretation. But Velez Mora was a man who read cumulative evidence. He did not discuss this with his wife, who knew about the meeting only in its outline. He did not discuss it with his lawyers or his accountants or the industry colleagues he had known for decades. He had learned in those months a new kind of silence. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, but the silence of a man who understands that some conversations cannot be had in the rooms where they would naturally occur. He kept the business running. He absorbed the losses without public acknowledgement. He made adjustments that he did not explain to anyone as adjustments. He maintained the position he had held in that office and found, to his own measured surprise, that maintaining it was easier than he had expected. Not because the pressure was light, but because the alternative, the version of himself that would have said yes that morning, was a man he could not locate anywhere in his understanding of himself. In 2003, at a dinner at his house in El Poblado, Rodrigo Velez Mora told his son the full story for the first time. His son Andres was 31 years old that year. He had come into the business 7 years earlier and had proved himself capable and careful, the qualities his father had hoped for and not entirely assumed. Escobar had been dead for 10 years by then. The Medellín of the early 90s, the checkpoints, the explosions, the specific atmospheric pressure of a city that had learned to read threat in the texture of ordinary days, had softened into something that still carried the memory of those years, but no longer lived inside them continuously. They had eaten well and were sitting with wine on the terrace that looked over the garden when Velez Mora began. He told it the way he had always known he would eventually tell it, carefully in sequence, without dramatization. The appointment, the visitor, the office, the question and the answer, the months after. Andres listened without interrupting. When his father finished, there was a silence between them that was different from their usual silences. Not the comfortable silence of men who know each other well enough that quiet is easy, but a silence with weight in it, with the specific texture of something being absorbed. "Were you afraid?" Andres asked. Velez Mora thought about this. "Not at the moment," he said. "At the moment I was occupied. There was too much to read in the room to have space for fear." He turned his wine glass slowly in his hand. "Afterward, yes. Not dramatically, but the kind of fear that settles in over time, that becomes part of the way you think about your days." He paused. "That kind." Andres asked why he had never said anything in all those years. "Because saying it would have made it a story," Velez Mora said. "And I didn't want it to be a story. I wanted it to be a decision I had made and continued to make every day." He looked at the garden. "The moment you turn it into something you tell people, it becomes about how it sounds. And it was never about how it sounds." Andres asked him one more question. What he remembered most clearly about the man who had sat across from him that morning in 1989. Velez Mora was quiet for a long moment. "The chair," he said finally, when he stood up and left. He had pushed it back at an angle, just slightly, and I sat there after he was gone, looking at that chair and thinking about the fact that he had not straightened it, that he had stood up and left the chair at that angle." He paused. "A man who straightens a chair before he leaves is a man who is thinking about the impression he is making." He was not thinking about the impression he was making. He set down his wine glass. "That was the thing I couldn't stop thinking about," he said. "He wasn't trying to frighten me. He wasn't performing anything. He came in, he asked, he received an answer, and he left. That was all it was to him." A long pause. "That was the frightening part." The garden was dark beyond the terrace light. Somewhere below the hill, the city moved through its ordinary night. Andres did not say anything. There was nothing adequate to add. He thought sometimes about what that version of himself would have looked like. The one who had said yes that morning. Not in the immediate aftermath. 5 years on, 10 years on, sitting at the same desk, looking at the same factory floor through the same window, carrying the accumulated weight of what he had allowed the operation to become. He tried to find, in that imagined version of himself, something recognizable. He could not find it. This was not heroism, he was careful to remind himself. It was not courage in any formal sense. It was something more basic. A man who had spent 30 years building a specific thing and had looked across a desk at an arrangement that would have required him to become someone who had not built that thing and had found the transaction simply impossible. Not noble, not calculated, impossible in the way that certain things are impossible, not because of fear, but because of an incompatibility so fundamental that the mind cannot locate the mechanism by which the thing would occur. There was a morning in August of that year, a gray Tuesday, the rainy season pressing down on the city, when he arrived at the factory before anyone else and stood on the floor among the quiet machines and understood, with sudden clarity, that the decision he had made in that office was not behind him. It had not resolved into the past. It was present in every day that followed, not as threat, not as consequence, but as the permanent condition of having looked at something directly and said what he said and remained afterward the man who had said it. He had never spoken of this to anyone, not his wife, not his lawyers, not his oldest colleagues. He had carried it the way certain men carry certain things, not as a burden exactly, but as a permanent feature of the interior landscape, something that had always been there once it arrived and could not be imagined away. The silence around it was not the silence of shame or regret. It was the silence of a man who understood that the value of a decision lives in the making of it, not in the telling. The moment it becomes a story, it belongs to the people who hear it. And this one, for 14 years, had belonged only to him. Until that evening on the terrace with his son, in the garden going dark beyond the light, and the wine in the city below. Until he decided finally that the time for keeping it had passed and the time for giving it had arrived.